Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, I'm going to first give you a little update. Stabby and Nick are unfortunately not here with us today. They are in the middle of moving from one place in California to another. I'm sure there were, I don't know what they have in California. I almost said cactus, but I don't think that's a California thing. Surfers, I guess. They're dodging surfers. There we go. That's the best I got, people. Nick is the touch of humor in this podcast, not me, clearly. So Michael, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. Mike Rothman. I guess I go by M.A. Rothman out in the interwebs. Author of thrillers, science-related stuff, all in the fiction realm. I mean, I've got nonfiction, but we won't talk about that. I have a history of having worked for some three-letter places in the past, and I am on the West Coast doing Silicon Valley stuff and author stuff at the same time for the moment.
So is it true you helped fake the moon landing?
Absolutely not.
Okay. The rumors, man, they're out there, sir.
Yep.
So the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we first found them. So I actually met Rothman when we were on the Sci-Fi Writers playing old school D&D. I think it was a long title for that series, but that was close. It's still out there somewhere on the interwebs. I think YouTube still has the old episodes, but that's where we met. And I've always meant to get him on the show. And so when we were booking for season 4, I said, no time like the present. So before we get started, sir, we have to, if you like Jack Reacher or Dirk Pitt, get ready. Okay. That's a good selling point. I'm sorry, I got distracted by the shinies. So first, before we get started, sir, we have to do the religion question. So Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
I'm thinking Star Trek. And it's going to be between the original and Next Generation, as the variants.
Okay. What is it about those two of the variants that speaks to you?
Well, the funny thing is, so my background is in science, and there are a lot of things that seem fantastical in Star Trek, a lot of hand-wavy stuff. But there's actually a lot of things that, even for the time frame that those things were filmed, they got a lot of science right. So it pleases the scientist in me. The contrast. I was never a Firefly person, and as to Star Wars, without getting into any controversy, certainly the original trilogy, near and dear to many people's hearts. But I always looked at that as science fantasy, and not even trying to touch on reality, which is fine because I like that stuff too. But the Star Trek was closer to my preferences.
Were you always into science? Was that like always your thing, or did you come to that later in life?
Yeah, I was a 6-year-old flipping through science books, and nerd at heart. When it comes right down to that.
I remember when I was in school, they used to have a series and it'd insert, famous either TV show or video game series, and it'd be like the science of. So I remember once that they had like the science of Halo at the library, and it talks about like everything that's real and everything they're guessing, which is kind of cool.
I mean, if you think about it, I mean, like they used to have this show. I mean, everything's still in reruns, but In Search Of, which was always narrated by Leonard Nimoy, oddly enough, and it was all about taking things that were usually like they talked about Project Blue Book, which was like the search for UFOs, or they talked about controversial things that were like maybe conspiracy theory or that it was kind of cool because nobody else was talking about that kind of stuff at the time. So I was always into weird science, mystery-ish kind of stuff. At the time, when Geraldo was opening, Al Capone's.
I remember.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everybody was tuned in, and it was nothing. But yeah, but it's stuff like that you know, yeah. I always get distracted by stuff like that. I enjoy that.
So, do you think Star Trek was unintentionally accurate, or do you think they knew what they were doing from the beginning? I didn't follow like the making of, so I actually don't know.
It's hard to tell. I mean, how much of it? I mean, even stuff that seemed. Well, let's put it this way. I think they got lucky in a lot of stuff, and I'll use one example, and I forget which movie it was from, but at one point in time, one of the characters was talking about like invisible aluminum or something that to hold like a whale, or it's like to create a aquarium large enough to transport a whale to Earth, or something like that, and it was made up stuff. It was like, what do you mean metal that's invisible or transparent? But it turns out nowadays they actually have like aluminum oxides and stuff that that are kind of like what they were talking about. So, but that's a new thing, as in like the last 10 years. So there's no way they knew about it. There's no consultant saying, yeah, this is what you should say because it's real. In some cases maybe they got lucky, but I think they tried. But it's
So,
kind of like a lot of science fiction nowadays. A lot of people try, to get it right.
so when it comes to some of these mysteries that always interest you, do you have some that you kind of wish never get solved because the mystery is more fun than the answer, or do you want answers to all of them?
Well, let's take something from current events, like the whole UFO thing. I find it bizarre, utterly bizarre, that all our lives we were like UFOs, conspiracy, Area 51, and are they there? Are they not there? And within the last year or two, we actually have the government and people from the government saying, yeah, there is stuff out there, and we have found stuff. I mean, they don't talk about details, but they showed their cards, and what I don't understand is there's no reaction. I'm like, what?
Because there's a lot of contrarians who like, oh, I want to believe, but now the government, because they just don't trust the government.
I guess, yeah, I'm very surprised by the lack of reaction. I mean, I guess it'd be different if they like start wheeling out ET and start showing it to everybody. But
Absolutely.
they're just the sheer fact that there are governmentish type people who have admitted to the things that have always been thought of in conspiratorial corners of our ecosystem. I'm like, wow, yeah, okay, and no one's freaking out or talking about it. I don't understand.
Do you remember the scene? Did you ever see the movie Independence Day?
Oh yeah, yeah,
There's the scene where the father character is leading like a group of people in a Jewish prayer because they're getting ready to get bombarded by the aliens, and they just tell the president that all this stuff was there and he didn't have the need to know. And the older guy's like, "What? You think they really spent $600 on a toilet seat?" Like the idea, of course, that's how they're funneling all the money.
right,
Which is
right. Yeah,
every time
exactly.
I think about aliens, I'm like, yeah, well, maybe.
We don't know what we don't know. Usually is the case. So
All right.
now that we know, it's like, did it matter? I mean, I don't know. I'm still baffled by the lack of reaction. I'll probably write that in a scene somewhere in one of my future books. I'm sure.
Yeah. I actually the thing everyone confuses when they talk aliens is they automatically think ET and sentient. Like if we found an organism living in like the sulfur flats of Yellowstone, or in Yellowstone, excuse me. Like clearly, it doesn't have to necessarily be carbon, and if it's a microscopic organism, it's still an alien if it's on another planet. I
Yeah.
think everyone assumes sentience when they say alien, and they don't necessarily need to. So
Agreed. And now, but the thing that's really the bizarre thing, and that's the thing that if people thought about it enough, going, wait a minute, all right, so this isn't just like what you're talking about, Jr. Is like microbes or little
right,
insects or whatever that are barely things we even recognize. Um, this is more about if they came to us, that means they have better technology than we do. So this isn't just about sentience. These are people who are creatures who could probably kick our butts. Um, because they know how to get to all the way to us, and it probably wasn't a neighboring planet. It was probably from very far away. So I'm like, this is actually kind of a big deal, But
Well, it's going to get even more interesting because they just found. So we're recording this on the 9th of February. You're going to hear this later in the month, but they just found today. It's 137 light years away, but they found a planet bigger than Earth, but it's capable of supporting human carbon-based life form.
it's in the Goldilocks zone.
It's in the Goldilocks zone, and they, as best as they can tell, it has water and land, which is the two other things we need. Because obviously, you can't just live in a water world. Like you'd have to have somewhere to set up shop because we're not aquatic creatures. So
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, and I've written this in some books already, but very few people think about it. And I guess this is for anybody who's a reader or a writer. Like one of the easiest ways to tell without having to actually go there, if you have life forms of some kind, is from remote, from light years away, would be, is there like more than just trace elements of oxygen in the atmosphere? And you can tell that by light refraction and whatnot. And the reason I say that is, like, I forget the exact percentage. We're like 20%, or we're greater than a handful of percent of free oxygen in our atmosphere, and the only reason for that is of the plant life historically that's been here. That's what's creating, because usually oxygen gets trapped by other things, and and you don't see it just free form in the atmosphere. So if you could detect something that, like you said, that nearby planet has water, using the same technique that you figured out there was water, if you could figure out, is there oxygen, like greater than 1%, then there's a very strong chance of life being on that planet. Now, we don't know what kind of life, but something that, exhales oxygen, like plant life of some kind. So little things that you rarely hear people talk about, but there are ways of figuring some of this stuff out.
and the other interesting thing is they're discovering, because they've been doing experiments with the International Space Station, that there are microorganisms capable of actually living in space, because they've had some that survived outside the space station and they bring it back. I mean, we took them up there for the science experiment, but that means that when we get to alien planets, if we find something, we have to be able to determine, did we bring it with us? Because some of those microbes can travel on the spaceship.
I mean, you've got some life forms that are like at like volcanic vents, under 30,000 feet of water, that living in a like acidic environment, like a usually acidic environment, just due to where it's at, and like 800 degrees. I mean, some ridiculous temperatures, and they're happy as anything. I mean, they wouldn't survive anywhere else, on this planet, but they're surviving right around those vents. So, that's as good as an alien creature from our perspective. It just happens to be on Earth. So, yeah, some things can be pretty resilient.
So it'll be interesting to see what they find out, and hopefully we live long enough to see it. Do you think Musk's going to make it to Mars?
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, I actually feel bad for, I mean, so some of the players that are in the common, mainstream media, I think get shortchanged because, regardless of what you think of the guy, at the 50,000 foot level, the guy is trying to do the right thing with, and again, doesn't matter what you believe, but he's trying to do climate things. He's like electric car and stuff. He's trying to improve batteries, and he's doing all, he's trying to do space exploration so humanity has a lifeline somewhere else. And I mean, I feel bad because he gets crapped on by lots of segments of our population. I'm just like, this is the one guy who's actually trying to do good with all of his resources, and he gets crapped on. So I feel bad for him. I hope he succeeds. I mean, I absolutely I'm team Elon when it comes to that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
There used to be the meme that there's so many X number of billionaires on the planet and not one decided to be Batman. And you
Yeah.
could almost compare what Elon Musk is doing with space as trying to do that proverbial Batman, using his money for good, so to speak. And
Yeah.
then as soon as he does that, everyone hates on him for it. It's like, well, now you know why nobody does that stuff.
Well, and that's the thing is that he's his own person. People who are at that level of success usually are there because they're a little eccentric in some ways. And he speaks his mind, and people don't like that. And there are other figures in our realm that do the same thing, and they don't like that either. And I'm like, yeah, people are they want something, but they want it in their in a package form that they prefer. I'm like, life doesn't work that way. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So the next round of religion questions. Are you ready for round 2, sir?
Sure.
Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Just on principle, I'm going to say Wheel of Time because at least that one got finished, and the guy who wrote it, didn't finish because he died. I other than the movies, I never read Narnia, so I can't I have no opinion. And the Game of Thrones thing isn't done yet, so I'm still I reserve opinion on that.
We used to have the third choice instead of Narnia was Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, but that just wasn't fair to everybody else. So we went with one of his contemporaries.
Yeah, because if Tolkien was there, I would have picked Tolkien. So
Yeah, everybody does. I mean, I think he's kind of
yeah.
the OG for fantasy, for modern fantasy.
Well, I mean, think about it. He was in essence writing epic fantasy in the 1930s. That isn't that far from what we appreciate as contemporary epic fantasy. So he was well ahead of his time.
Yeah, and if you ever get some wild hair up your backside, dear listener, I suggest you read his biography. His experience in World War One, it was intense.
Yeah.
Yep. The fact that he survived to do what he did is just amazing in general. So the Psalm was no joke.
Yep.
So, all right. And because we are civilized, we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. Troglodytes. Oh, it helps if I can speak when I say that word. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Coffee black.
Excellent.
And I mean, I'm okay with tea too, but that's also no sugar, just plain, just strong.
Okay. Is it a general position on sugar, or you just don't like it?
So if I want a sweet drink, I'll get something that I guess I look at coffee and tea as like from a purist point of view. It's like I like the slight bitterness, and I'm looking for a jolt of caffeine of some kind or another. Or, I'm not necessarily like my wife prefers to have a little a couple drops of coffee with her sugar and milk. So so I'm not of that school, so to speak.
Okay. Do you have a favorite blend of coffee, or do you just drink whatever's there?
Anything that isn't burnt. So medium roast, even dark roast, as long as it's not too bitter, and um, not a fan of Starbucks. My wife loves it, but
Not the Starbies.
it's not my favorite.
Okay. So you've had a passion for science. How did going from science, which is generally one of the hard disciplines, to something in the soft science realm, which would be creating literature, like how did that happen for you?
All right. So so I actually spoke about this recently. It's like anybody in any of my high school English teachers would laugh hysterically if I had suggested back then that I was going to write a book, much less any number of books. Because I never really thought of myself as a creative writer at all, whatsoever. Now in college, I kind of, I mean, I didn't enjoy the class because for me, it was boring. I just didn't enjoy the subject. I preferred the science and math environment. Um, and not a surprise that when I was in college, the only English related class I took was one that I needed to graduate. So like I took one, um, and and I learned a lesson. So if you want to, at least in the when I went to school in the ye olden days, um, I ended up taking an English class during the summer, and I had a huge advantage. The huge advantage was that was the same time that all the people who were like English as a second language type, would take it as well. So I was like the only native speaker of English in the class. So it made my life very, very easy. And it was the only time I'd ever been like ridiculously complimented on my writing skill. But I kind of tempered my belief on the adulation from the professor, because I was like, yeah, but you're comparing it to the guy who barely knows the alphabet. So it is what it is. I- so I would never have imagined myself in the whole creative writing thing. It wasn't until I had kids and I started doing the whole yeah, come up with bedtime stories thing that I started going, okay, well, because I was making stories up on the fly. And when I did that, I ended up losing track and the kids were calling me on it. So I started writing down the stuff ahead of time. And that ended up just leading to me writing like what ended up being, a trilogy of, you know, kind of, I mean, I was writing at the time literally epic fantasy, which is not really what I'd argue that I'm good at, but it's where I started because the kids enjoyed that, and I mean, at some point in time, I showed it to a few people. They liked it, and talking to a couple known, Dave Farland or Kevin Anderson and stuff, and they encouraged me to take the plunge, and the rest is history, really. I guess I'm mostly known for my hard science fiction or techno thriller kind of genre material, and which is kind of a pretty big leap from epic fantasy. And my litmus test was, I didn't, as a science guy, it felt very strange for me to talk about dragons and dwarves, and and what, when I say it out loud, seems ridiculous and silly. I'm like, yeah, well, let me talk about a mafia guy who, is having issues in the big city, or so something that could probably have or possibly happen, versus the dragons and the dwarves and the orcs and whatnot. So I felt more comfortable, at least with like with identifying as the author of you know thrillers versus epic fantasy. Now I don't care, whatever. I've lost that weirdness, but when I started off, I was like, yeah, I don't know about the epic fantasy thing. Let me stick to something else.
So, did you ever publish the ones you wrote while reading bedtime stories to your kids?
Yep, they're out there. It's the Trimoria series, I think is called. Starts with Agent of Prophecy, but yes, it's out there. Uh, it's been well received. I mean, it's a good story. It's just not what I'm known for.
That's a lot more wholesome than what I did with my kids when they were little. We sang Army running cadences and generally involved death to commies. It's what I knew.
Yeah, exactly.
And it worked. So in the end, if it helped them sleep, that's all that mattered.
Yep.
So how did you come up with the premise for what is the Levi Yoder series? The
Uh,
name definitely sticks out because we actually have a huge, like Yoder Dairies is huge in the southeastern region. Is if you want the milk delivered kind of company.
right, right. So I'm not sure what led me down that path. Um, so I mean, I remember one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to write something that was, yeah, it's going to sound strange, but yeah, because the Levi Yoder series has nothing to do with James Bond, but I liked several things mishmashed together. You know, I liked the James Bond thing as a story arc, in as much as each of the stories are kind of self-contained, so like serialized stories, like you know, each of those stories don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, but they have a similar cast of characters and theme. So I wanted to do something like that. I also like the idea of Q, the quartermaster, the guy, the gadget guy. So I knew I was going to have one of those people, in the mix. And then as the main character, I wanted something that you wouldn't expect. And you wouldn't expect some guy who a tough guy, like a Jack Reacher type of guy, who's a tough guy, um, really resilient, smart, but kind of unassuming, and put into a situation that is very unusual. So imagine a guy who grew up in an Amish community and who finds himself, and the story doesn't start like this. The story starts very differently, but his background is, he, when he decided, when he was, old enough, he didn't want to stick to the Amish community. He went to the big city, in this case, New York, and he, you know, ended up helping out some guys who ended up eventually becoming part of the mob. And let's just say that he's the only made man in the Italian mafia who is not Italian, which is not something you would necessarily expect a former Amish farmer as a fixer in the mafia. But that's what we've got. And he becomes very conflicted. The theme of this is how much trouble can I put this poor guy through, and how does he end up, overcoming. So
So
that's really where it started.
is he a hero, an anti-hero?
No, he. So I let kind of like the caption says behind me. An angel in wolf's clothing. So yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy, and people will appreciate him ultimately for what's inside. But his tactics are, let's just say, he's willing to bend the rules to do what is ultimately the greater good. So he's not behind. He's not. Uh, he won't dismiss some tactics that would be quite illegal, to get you know good done in the name of good, essentially. So um, yeah, and I suppose that's not too far from Reacher. Though Reacher has a background, I think, as an MP, if I recall. If I'm remembering correctly, it's been a long time since I've read any of the Reacher novels. Um, but
So
yeah.
is this pure thriller? Does it go into other places as far as genres go?
Uh, so book, so this evolved. Book one is very much, and actually the entire series is very much, I'd call it a more a mainstream thriller than anything else. Um, you know, as is like a 007 novel, I would call also a mainstream thriller, though it involves uh, British equivalent of the CIA, and international intrigue and whatnot, and gets some technical stuff. You get gadgets and stuff. So some might argue it's a techno thriller, um, but it largely stays there. Book one is a little unusual, and probably because I was just feeling my way through the series. But it, the entire series is, like I said, kind of a mainstream thing. There are elements of there that are certainly explainable via science, and I won't give anything away there. That someone might go, you know, that seems like a fantasy-esque thing, and it's not. Um, so some might argue I'm skirting some science fiction elements in there. So, but I'd argue it's mostly a kind of a its bones are a thriller series.
Now, there's another series with a Yoder character in your archive of mini book, because I don't think you sleep because you've got like a bazillion books written. Is that
Right.
linked to this character in any way? I think it's like
Yeah.
Rachel Yoder, I think is what it was.
Yeah. So we've got the Alicia Yoder series.
Alicia, there we go.
Yeah. And
That wasn't even close.
But basically, in book 3 of the Levi Yoder series, you're introduced. He's got some adopted daughters. He's essentially rescued at some point. So without getting into backstory, but imagine, So there's a spin-off series that has to do with his now grown up daughter, who is on her own, or like I'm putting the finishing touches to book 4 of of the spinoff, and and essentially she is his daughter. For most of her life she doesn't know what her father does, other than he's a businessman of some kind. And um so there's definitely crossover elements. So anyone who's read Levi Yoder, reading the spinoff will feel very familiar. um yeah.
So you compared it a little bit to James Bond. Now, James Bond will generally have companion characters in every novel, but they don't always cross, with the exception of like Q. They don't. Is it Q that makes the weapons? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. With the exception of like him and maybe the boss, sometimes you don't see those characters movie to movie, book to book. So did you take the reoccurring characters role, or were they one-offs for his companions for every novel? Or did he work completely alone?
Yeah, so it does follow the premise. So someone reading book 1 will think, oh, we've got a love interest. Book 2, you might realize, oh, maybe not so much. And book 3 is like, oh, another love interest, maybe not so much. Or it's So there are certain characters, kind of like with the Q. So there's certain characters that are almost always there, as kind of background, not main player characters, so to speak, from a gaming perspective. But there are a couple of NPCs, non-player characters that you tend to see as background characters that are common. And there is a lot of crossover, even between the two series, both of the Yoder series. Like right now, Alicia, the daughter, is off in the Vatican doing stuff, and she's she's got a cohort who is one of the folks from the New York Mafia who's acting as escort. So yeah, there is a lot of crossover. There's some folks who are repeating, but where I think I don't know if the audience knows who Dirk Pitt is, but Clive Cussler is a fairly popular, or was a fairly popular author. He's since passed away, but
I
Dirk Pitt
loved his
was.
books, the Dirk Pitt books.
Yeah, yeah. So for a very long time, Dirk Pitt was kind of this bachelor, and as James Bond for the most part, he always had love interests and whatnot, but there were always different girls. Um, Dirk Pitt was more a bachelor, but in some of those later books, I think he ended up getting a main interest. Yeah,
He got married.
and and, and I think in my opinion, I think that it hurt the series to an extent, because as soon as you have something kind of anchoring you to a certain lifestyle, um, it 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 you lose the freedom of someone who isn't married, or who has I think for a reader, you're like always wondering, well, is this gonna be a love interest? Where's he going? Is there i- are there things that i- you know is there titillation? My books aren't that kind of book, but there's always an interest, and going, oh, is he gonna hook up with this person, or is he flirting with her, or is she flirting with him? When one of them is married, you lose a lot of those things, and it eliminates certain elements that I think some readers really enjoy. So I'm probably not going to have any of my characters get married, or at least not for the foreseeable future. So
Yes, but Dirk Pitt got the spinoff with his kids because he had the twins that came from that union that come
yes,
in later books.
yeah, no, agreed.
Do you do the Clive Cussler and put yourself in every book as a like a bus driver or some minuscule like random tiny character?
I haven't yet, though I'm not against that at all. I haven't purposefully done that. Uh, though I think I'd be, I think it'd be amusing for my, for me to actually do that at some point. Yeah.
He never made a big deal of it, but like the bus driver's name would be Clive, and he describes the bus driver, and you look at the jacket in the back, and I'm like, oh, okay. So he was subtle with it, but it was always fun to look for that as you'd read it. Like you'd be looking to see where he put himself in, and it was never like a groundbreaking role. It was always just like an extra kind of thing.
Now, I mean, some folks may argue that I put myself in some of the main characters anyway. Just so in real life, I'm a foodie. I'm a big fan of food, and
Weird
uh,
food sometimes too.
yeah, weird, all sorts of food. I'm not a fan of celery, but other than that, uh,
Who is?
most food I'm a big fan of. So and so most of the main characters I write, oddly enough, almost every book, I think every book has a food scene of some kind. That plays a part. So so sometimes people are looking for that, because that's maybe that's a way that I'm sneaking certainly aspects of my personality in. So
So have you ever found a food that you're like, nope, that's just too weird for me?
no, I mean, I've tried. I've been all over the world, and I've tried some really. Yeah, I've tried stuff that's illegal in, like Kazu Marzu in Sardinia. Yeah, if folks are not familiar with that, that is maggot infested cheese, um, and needless to say that you can only get it locally. It's not allowed in the rest of the EU. They're like, no, because these are live maggots, that are in this cheese. Um,
I
yeah,
might die trying to eat that. I don't know that I could do it.
yeah. I mean, I tried it. I didn't like it. To me, it tasted. Yeah, it wasn't even so much that it was rotten. It had this ammonia-ish taste that I was just like, ew. Yeah, it was just unpleasant. So I mean, to me, I'm like, what's the appeal of this? I'm like, I don't get it. So to me, it just didn't taste good. I'll try almost anything. But no, is there anything that I refuse to taste? I mean, there were some things that I was glad I wasn't offered, because the smell was so foul that I was just like, man. I mean, sometimes smells can be deceiving, but when something smells like a sewer, you're like, yeah, you know what? I'm okay not trying it. It's like,
Okay.
because like stinky tofu is a thing that I'm thinking of, in Asia, which is very popular street food. Um, but I remember being in a restaurant in Taipei, and it was a nice restaurant, but suddenly I'm like looking around, and because I'm smelling, I'm going, I'm s- I'm thinking that we must be near a bathroom somewhere that must have had backed up or something. I mean, this is the Far East, so yeah, you just never know. And I'm like, yeah, there's got to be some sewer issues in this place. And it turned out, the people in the next table over had ordered like stinky tofu on, these like little gas burner things, and it was bubbling up, and I was just like, whoa, yeah, that's some awful stuff. Awful smelling. I'm sure it tasted lovely, but
All right. On that happy note, we're going to give you time to cleanse your palate while we air this beautiful commercial, and hopefully, you can take some deep breaths while we're doing that, and then we'll come back and you can listen to the rest.
They picked a fight with the wrong species. A nation at war, the United Stars of America, born in the conflagration of an unprovoked alien attack, the newest entrant to galactic politics took the few crumbs of hypertech gifted to it and ran with them, soon expanding over dozens of star systems and establishing a wide trade network, protected by its powerful navy and the dreaded Warp Marines. In a fight to the death, a single Marine platoon tasked with protecting an embassy on a hostile alien planet, an embassy and the fragile human enclave around it, that soon finds itself surrounded by armed mobs. Can the Marines and a ragtag band of civilian and Navy personnel survive long enough to be rescued?
Recognize that voice?
I do.
um, so we've talked a little bit about the types of characters with your story. When you compare it to things like Clive Cussler and Jack Reacher, with those settings were all over the place. Is your series, the Levi Yoder series, is it all set in New York since it's the New York mob, or do you kind of go global travel?
No, it's global. I mean, the first one largely is, well, actually, no, I think all of them go international. So, yeah, anyone reading my stuff will inevitably go on a trip somewhere, and it just happens to be a lot of places that I've personally been to. So I can speak firsthand about many places. So. Um, yeah, we span the globe. Yeah, depending on the series, it's yeah, we spend time in Russia. We definitely are all over the U.S., Asia, etc. So yeah, we're all over the place.
The only places I went were places most people don't want to go. So
Yeah, yeah.
the Middle East comes to mind. So if the stories are set all over, are they set in modern times? Or are they set in a period in the past?
Everything is essentially modern times. At least for these series. I mean, I've got some. What I write tends to be current. I mean, I do have some hard sci-fi that is actually set like 50 years in the future, but but it's very recognizable to anyone reading it. So I try to stick to the here and now. And I follow kind of like the Crichton model, where I look at Michael Crichton as kind of the father of techno thriller. And so a lot of people have compared some of my stuff to his, and um yeah, I like the modern stuff because it really does allow the reader to go, "What if?" It's like, because I can describe scenes and situations that are at least physically possible. And depending on how sciency I get, you know, they'd be technically accurate. So. Uh, yeah, I try to keep it in the here and now, places that people can relate to, and another unusual thing. Almost no, I think all my books have an appendix where I talk about the science in the book. Yeah, so if there's technical aspects to the book, I'll talk about it.
That's interesting. Do you do footnotes or you just list it in the appendix?
Um, I don't call them out specifically, and say, here's a footnote. I actually have an author's note section, and and a kind of a chapter at the end of the book where I do talk about elements of the book. Whether I mean, there's not in Levi Yoder, but in some of my books, I might even talk about time travel. I'm like, I'll spend a page or two talking about the actual science behind it. I mean, because I've got a physics background, so I'll talk about what. I'll give people enough keywords and buzzwords around explaining the science so that if they're really interested, I'll give them a clue as to what it's all about, and then they'll have enough vocabulary to actually go look up the rest. And if they want to dive into the rat hole of knowing more, I arm them with enough data to get dangerous.
So speaking of arming people with enough data, so we have some families that listen to this show. What would you say your Levi Yoder series is rated as far as like family friendly? Is it like 16 up? What would the rating for your novel be?
Yeah. So oddly enough, and I found that some people have very different things that they're, I don't like using the word triggered, but that they're sensitive to. Like most of my books really don't have bad language. I don't have F-bombs. But like the Levi Yoder series, people can die. And Levi being, again, that angel in wolf's clothing, that wolf will if he's trying to get information about his dead wife, or or trying to figure out who killed her, he's willing to go to some extremes to get the information he needs. And that doesn't limit it to talking bad, yelling and screaming at someone. He might torture somebody. So there are a couple scenes that might make some people a bit squeamish. It's not excessive, but it's there. So it's at least PG-13 plus, kind of thing. If I'm thinking from a movie rating perspective. But from what I understand, nothing that any like high school kid wouldn't have read anyway, or much worse. If there's any sex, it's off screen. There's none of that. So I don't have like, I mean, I have sexual situations, as in like flirting and whatever, but none of that's, it's fade to black kind of stuff. If there's anything at all, so.
Okay, we're going to show them. I can't talk as intelligently about the art as Nick when he's here, but your covers, just so people get a look at here. So this is book one. I'm assuming this is New York City?
Yeah. So backdrop would be New York in this case. So book one actually goes between New York and actually parts of Russia. So so we primarily are in both of those places through that book. So
have you actually been to Russia to compare it to? Is that one of the places you've traveled?
Yeah.
Nice. And so this is, if you guys want to look, this is his cover for book two in the series. I like the silhouette of the guy with the rifle at the top. And clearly that's DC because you've got the monument.
Right.
I like this one. It's very bright.
Yeah, the cover guy that I have is actually I what's nice is I get to see a couple of the options, and I choose the one that I like the most of what he comes up with from the description of the book itself. So this one is set in DC. Most of these things have some level of meaning, whether the backdrop is appropriate for the for the story. I mean, certainly a lot of stuff does happen in DC in this one, DC and in Japan, oddly enough. And there's a reason for that sniper. The, 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 there will be some sniper action in book 2. So
nice. So, and then we got book 3's cover, more sniper action.
Yeah. Yep.
And you avoided the trigger discipline question. You get a lot of art with weapons in it because you showed it for the back, so you don't know, so you can only assume. I like the breaking glass that you can see.
Yeah, I mean, all of these you can pretty much count that there's going to be violence in these. I mean, the guy is I try not to water down who Levi Yoder is. He's I mean, he's a member of the mafia, but he's a good guy. So and for a lot of people, that's hard to wrap their heads around. But once they read it, they're going, "Yeah, okay, I get it." But it's not like he's a kindergarten teacher. So
yeah, that'd be a boring story. And then finally, book 4, The Swamp, another DC, appropriately named.
right.
So
we visit a lot. There's a lot of DC and Russia happening here. So
okay. So when you do your settings, do you let the story dictate where they're going? Do you plot it out in advance? Like, what's your writing process like? Now, obviously, our audience is all readers, so kind of gear it towards that.
Yeah. So for me, it's actually very simple. When I started writing, so I'm an engineer, scientist, engineer as a background. So when I first started writing, I did what I did in my engineering life, which is I wrote everything down ahead of time. This is the roadmap for everything I'm going to go, put together for the story. And I've evolved from that. Because I think you lose some of the spontaneity. So my process nowadays is I know how the book ends before I even get to word 1 of the book, and I have a pretty good idea of what the first scene will be. And there's a term called in media res, so in the middle of things. I like to start with an action scene, whether it's you know, uh, you know, maybe somebody, bad guy taking good guy out, or there's something, you're tossed in the middle of something, usually scene 1. So I usually know where I'm starting. I know how it ends, and I'll usually know a couple of scenes that I want to include along the way, and I then kind of just go. So I know where I'm starting, and as I'm writing, um, literally the process for me is by the time I'm done on that first day, I've written however much I'm going to write. And, for any writer, the story is never going to be fresher in your head as when you're ready to put your pencil down. So before I put my pencil down, I'll at least write up like a paragraph or 2 of the next couple of scenes, you know, what they're going to be. Yeah, here are the things I'm going to cover. Levi, beats up bad guy. Whatever the blurb's going to be for the next couple of scenes, and I'll just write that down. That way, when I start the next day, I'll then have an idea of what I'm going to write. And that's usually, and that'll take me through to the end.
Now, you said when you put your pencil down, so are you one of the weird ones who actually writes by hands? I know I've seen an interview Marco Cluse did, and he actually used to do that for his beginning novels. He wrote it by hand.
No, I personally do it the way I think most people nowadays do, which is word processor, Microsoft Word, and I do the computer. Now I'm extremely jealous of the folks like Kevin Anderson, who he's gonna outlive us all, because he's always hiking. He lives in Colorado. He's hiking in the mountains, and he's dictating into his whatever phone or otherwise um, the chapters for his book. So not only is he healthy because he's exercising all the time, he's really productive, because when he's exercising, he's actually stories are spilling out of his head. I don't know how he does that. I need to be able to stare at the words and massage them, and and think about it, and stare at the internet or whatever. I don't know how he manages. I wish I could do that. But yeah, no, I do it more conventional way. Yeah.
So right now there are 4 books in this series. Is it going to continue for Levi, or does this story end at the 4th?
No, I'm definitely going to continue. I spent a little time focusing on the spin-off. So with Alicia, and I'm putting the fourth book of the Alicia one will. I think it's being released in March, at least in English, and German, French, etc. But so that's coming out in March, and I plan on trying to put a new book on each one of those series a year. So, so kind of spread it out, and it, like any, like the Jack Reacher novels or the James Bond novels, they are intended to be standalone, but they're best read in order, but they don't even have to be, because a lot of the characters are the same. They're just different situations.
Now, you mentioned with the Levi Yoder stuff that you pull in some of the science that you know. So even though it feels fantastical, sometimes it's real science. Do you pull in the history as well? Like that's one of the things Clive Cussler was known for, and you use Dirk Pitt as an example. So do you pull in some of that historic tidbit?
Yeah, I do. I try to. So I avoid message fiction. If I mean, there's some people who want to teach lessons or something. I don't do that. But so I like so I've gotten in a couple reviews. People have said things that I actually really, it has always been my intent. My intent has always been, if someone goes ahead and reads one of my novels, they've probably come away learning or knowing something they didn't know about before. So, if there's a message I'm ever giving in any of my books, it's more about exposing the reader to something that they weren't aware of. Like, yeah, whether it's new tidbits of technology or the history of something, or what's possible in, you know, you know, some advances of science, or the history of the Vatican, as like, oddly enough. So, so there are elements, and the challenge for the reader is, I mean, these are works of fiction, but trying to identify what part is real versus what part isn't real. It's kind of like Dan Brown in a lot of his Da Vinci Code stuff. I think people were confused about, like the Priory of Sion and stuff like that. It's like, is that a real thing? It's like, well, no, that was completely made up, but it sounds real. So it's like, so what elements of the story are actually real versus what elements were kind of whole cloth made up. So.
Do you tell the readers that at the end with your notes, or do you leave the mystery?
I tend to leave the mystery, but there are things that, if they're major elements of the story, I try to cover, the technical aspects of things. Like for instance, if Q comes up with, a fancy throwing dagger, or some new bulletproof vest or whatever, I'll talk about maybe the metallurgy, what goes into some of the stuff, talk about some technical aspects of things that might be cutting edge or people don't know about, or shear thickening fluids that are used in in some vest technology nowadays. So yeah, I get a little weird on some of the technical aspects of it. It may not be key to the story, but I've grown into the habit of introducing things that seem kind of cool, but the coolness isn't always made up. It's oftentimes, at least in my stories, real. You just it's not common knowledge necessarily.
That's the other thing, is sometimes people forget when they see things that they don't like, oh, that's not right. Because I remember is sometimes people forget how quickly science changes. For instance, some of the stuff that was just, this is the way you did it when I enlisted in the Army, by the time I left, technology had made things different, and that just wasn't true anymore. And so I can't imagine if you're looking at science because you were trained, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and you didn't keep up with it, how much of that's going to be a shock to you.
Well, I mean, think about it. We're old enough. I mean, nowadays it's maybe 25 years ago, but 25 years ago doesn't seem that long ago. Like the 1999 time frame. That's 25 years ago, believe it or not. But you would not have believed that in your hand you have the content of the world's knowledge accessible to you. So that doesn't seem that seems like something of science fiction. So
it was considered obscure. I mean, I remember math teachers like, you have to learn to memorize all these formulas because you'll never have a calculator with you when you need it. And now everyone's got a cell phone with a calculator on it.
Right. I mean, I've got thousands of dollars worth of camera lenses and all sorts of other camera equipment that are collecting dust, because usually my phone is kind of good enough and it's always on me versus having to lug the equipment around. So it's things evolve over time.
So it sounds like your voice includes nerding out sometimes on the techno details, even if it isn't necessarily integral to the plot. I know Clive Cussler was known for a lot of his aquatic stuff. He liked diving. It was very clear in his books. Do you have anything like that that's sort of your signature with your thrillers, or is the science the thing?
So I tried to not. I mean, I try to integrate things. So my audience is purposefully Joe Sixpack. I want everybody to be the audience. So I think if you're doing the science right, you don't need to know about science to be able to appreciate the science. So unless you're reading one of my hard sci-fi novels, like Primordial Thread or something like that, where I do dive fairly deep into some arguably advanced concepts, but even then, you're in a situation where you as an author need to know, if you're going too far, you're going to lose a good portion of the audience, and that's what I do not want to do. So anything I cover, I try to cover it in a way that is seamless to the story. You might spend a couple pages with Q as Q is nerding out, over the technical aspects of the thing that he's giving Levi. And Levi's like, yeah, whatever. Which Levi is representing the reader in that respect. It's like, as long as it works, okay, whatever. I didn't understand anything you just said. So he's representing the everyman in that respect. And so I don't have a signature thing, like Clive Cussler does a lot of nautical stuff. I guess my signature thing is inevitably almost all of my books have technology weaved into it, but you don't need to be a technologist or a science nerd to be able to appreciate it. That's always my goal. Is you should be able to be, my mom should be able to go ahead and, who's not a scientist, should be able to appreciate the story for what it is.
Okay, so you indie produce these, so you self-publish these novels. Does that mean that do you still have audiobooks for these? Because you said you had them in foreign languages.
Yeah. So So certainly all my English stuff has audiobooks. And there are foreign and a lot of my German novels have audiobooks as well. Um, what I've found is the audio audience differs in the quantity. So yeah, for me, it's ROI. I mean, just like with any publishing. So you know, if I'm going to spend X amount of dollars, how long will it take me to get that money back? Is inevitably the question any author asks themselves or any publisher asks themselves. And I've just learned that you know English is easier because certainly in the U.S. we have and Australia I think too, and Canada. Um, we have a commute society, so it's much more common for people to be commuting and listening to audiobooks and whatnot. Whereas i- a lot of parts of Europe, it's not as prevalent. So their commute might be either a lot shorter or it's just not as popular. So I don't see for me and oftentimes for me to get good audio quality, it's almost twice as expensive. So it's twice the cost for me to produce a quality audio product in a foreign language for one fourth or one fifth the audience. It just doesn't oftentimes make sense. So
So
I,
you
I don't have it in
so
some
you
places.
mentioned Levi obviously left the Amish faith. Does that come back in later? Does he go back to his farm, or is that just the background?
Oh no, it's more than the background. Because Alicia, you know, his yeah, he's actually, I mean, it's elements of the story. Um, and it's not actually talked that much about in book one, but it's extensively covered in book two. Um, where his mother, Levi's mother, has still a farm, where he grew up in Pennsylvania, and so that becomes certainly elements of the story. And even in book one, he does go back. And so it's a constant. There is a home there, so to speak. And Alicia was actually brought up with with Levi's mother, so you know for a variety of reasons. So yeah, it's definitely still a strong element to his identity and the storyline.
So, given how closed off that religious community can be, how did you go about doing your research to get it right for that particular element?
Well, it's right in as much as there's certain elements that I knew 100%. Like at a certain, and I'm going to screw up the term, so I won't even actually use it. But there's a certain age that a lot of Amish youth will will be encouraged to explore
The
and
Rumspringa.
for Rumspringa and and most of them come back and join the community, but some choose not to. And Levi would have been one of the ones who chose not to. And so the story rarely focuses on the Amish community as a whole, but more about there's certain elements that are just understood. It's like it's a farming community oftentimes. So his mother has a farm, and his father had passed away, and there are kids that help raise the crops and everything else. So, but a lot of the details of that aren't necessary to the story. The details are having to do with you know, just certain scenes are appear. You know, I would say, like for instance, in book one, let's say there's 100 scenes in the book. Maybe two or three of them are having anything to do with rural Pennsylvania. So it's not. I didn't stretch the imagination too much to focus on details of that life because he wasn't living that life. He even kids who aren't part of the community, it's not like the mother has disowned them. It's like it's just they're not part of the community, and but he will come back and visit, and there is a refuge for him, so to speak, and that's the extent of it. So I don't focus too much on it, though it's not purely as a backstory to Levi himself.
It's an interesting backstory in that, given it was more rural upbringing, he would have skills that the average city dweller urbanite wouldn't have, and
Exactly.
believably so.
Exactly.
What made you choose to make it Amish as opposed to any just generic farmer or any other organization you could have given him as a backdrop?
Because I wanted him to be a bit of a Luddite, someone who wasn't a technical. So I'm a tech person, so I wanted him to be kind of the opposite of that, so that as the main character, I would have the Q equivalent, who might, or there might be other people in his environment that nerds out about some things, but Levi just doesn't even know how to use the computer, or if he does it reluctantly and is not a very big fan of it, which is the opposite of me. So I wanted to have some of that contrast, because I think there are people who can certainly relate to, it's like I know nothing about the computer, and I don't want to know anything about the computer, and I think people can somewhat relate to that, or the technical details about certain things. Levi's upbringing would have been rural and practical, and for what I put Levi through, necessary.
So, obviously, dreaming big. Someday Hollywood comes knocking on your door and they say, "We want to turn this into a movie." Do you have like a dream? This is who I envision in my head as Levi for an actor.
Yeah, I think Jack Reacher stole my guy, because he seems pretty good, but um, I, probably not Tom Cruise. Yeah, so yeah, I try not to think too much about that. Yeah, because the Yoder series has been optioned a couple times, and and like anything, I mean, the you know, eh, for those who don't know, the idea of a popular book becoming a movie is kind of like hitting the lotto, and the way it happens, if it's very popular, Hollywood, a Hollywood film company might say, hey, I want to pay a little bit of money to get the rights to make the movie. And there's 99.9% chance I'm not going to make the movie. But in case I do, I want to get first dibs. So they'll pay, the publisher, author, some small amount to reserve those first dibs, so to speak. So that's happened a couple times for some of my books, or some, a handful. But yeah, I try not to think too much about it, because it's such a, I understand math very well, and so the chances are so slim. It's like, yeah, I don't think too hard about it. It's not like that, and because if and when it did come to pass, it's not like they're going to ask me who I want. Yeah,
That question is more who you picture him in your head as, more than the
right.
realism of actually making the movie.
Right. I mean, to me, it's I've always pictured him as kind of a rugged, handsome guy who could blend in a crowd. So 6 foot, dark hair, rugged features, and but not I guess I'd argue Reacher's kind of like a bigger guy. And Levi is a bit more unassuming in his stature. I mean, he's 6 foot, so he's tall, not overly so, etc. So I think any number of people could play him. But again, Levi's kind of also a tough guy. So whoever it would be would have to have some spunk. So.
Now, when you say tough guy, do you mean like bruiser, beat him up with his fists, or is he more lead therapy at a distance?
He's hands on.
Okay. Does he have like a preferred when you write him? Because like they try to add the martial arts angles when they're writing a lot of the thriller stuff. Does he have a preferred style? Is it more just improvised grappling?
But book one really goes in a lot into a lot of that, and where I guess I'd argue in his youth he was a bruiser type and just tough as nails, farm boy stock. So you take it for what it is. They're usually from fairly they're stout type gentlemen. So he was pretty good in a fight before, but in book one, he has his own kind of like walkabout time frame in the very beginning of the book, after his wife passes away, that forces him into a situation where he's learned martial arts to the nth degree. So he learns from some of the best in his travels, and he picks up little bits and pieces from all over the place, including enhancing some of his uh, what do you call it? Survival skills. So a lot of the beginning of the book is setting him up for what will come. What will come, and and he definitely leverages that throughout the series.
Okay. So is there anything that I didn't think to ask that you want to tell us about the Levi Yoder series and Levi specifically before we wrap it up?
I think for anyone to be able to relate to it, Angel in Wolf's Clothing does kind of, it's my summation of what he's like. It's the good guy with the gruff exterior. That's kind of, and I think maybe Jack Reacher comes off a little bit like that, but I would say Levi is probably a little bit darker than Reacher is. He's part of the mafia, and a lot of people have very strong preconceived notions of what the mafia is like. Not good guys. Take that for what it is. He has his own code that may be a little different than what the mafia's code is, and he sticks to it. And it's very evident through the story.
Okay, I'll take that. So if listeners or viewers at home wanted to check you out and follow you on the internet, how can they get in touch with you?
So M.A. Rothman, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and I do have a website which you can send comments on, michaelarothman.com, and that's pretty much it.
All right, I will link to all of that in the show notes, dear listener. This is a part of the interview where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book, so do your part. And you can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, Twitter, our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com for professional purposes only. We have our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. And if you want to send a hate mail, Madam Stabby Stab's also linked in her Insta, Twitter, and email. We have our website at anchor.fm/blasters-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-blades, where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on, or you can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. And with that being said, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my absentee, insane, crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And you will notice in March, we resumed the 3-a-week schedule. While we were building our buffer while Nick recovered, we went to Mondays and Fridays for February, but March will be right back on track. So look for your Wednesday episode again coming next month. All right. Thanks for coming on, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Sure. No problem. Thanks, guys.
We'll have to have you on for your other stuff, because I've got your time trial books as in the Upstream review list that they gave us as some of the stuff to review. So the one you wrote, I think it's Bane.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. Anything with time travel and just history stuff is up my alley. So
Yep.
thanks for coming on.
Sure, no problem.